Yes, Nosferatu has always been this sexual. The new Robert Eggers version of the 1922 Murnau classic came out this past Christmas, or January 2nd where I live, and has sparked discourse about its themes, their treatment, and the film's overall horniness. I feel like if I see one more wannabe goth edgelord take about how the normies cannot handle gothic romance, I'm gonna throw all my electronics out the window, purchase a replica of Orlok's coffin, and spend the rest of my life living under a bridge, asking passersby to answer my vampire riddles. Nosferatu, as well as Dracula by Bram Stoker, which the 1922 film was an unlicensed adaptation of, has, like all vampire media, always possessed sexual undertones and dealt with the topic. Vampires, my beloved, are rich in the themes they represent, from class antagonism to racialized otherness and, of course, sexuality. These bloodsuckers are a mirror that allows us to see ourselves clearer and explore all things monstrous and foreign, and they become all the more interesting when explored in the context of the age they were created in. So this is exactly what we're going to do here. I'm going to take a look at the 3 renditions of the story, as well as Dracula, of course, which served as the foundation for the 1922 film by Murnau, and examine how they deal with the question of sexuality and the relationships between Orlok, Thomas, and Ellen in particular. This video is going to be dealing with some sensitive topics. Here they are on the screen right now, as well as the rating given to the 2024 movie by unconsenting media, so viewer discretion is definitely advised. Since I'm going to be focusing on a very specific aspect of Nosferatu, I wanted to point you to a video by Be Kind Rewind that provides a more general overview of the 3 movies and the differences and commonalities between them. I found it while doing some preliminary research and thoroughly enjoyed it. So if you're looking for something that encompasses more than just this one topic, or are just interested in it, the link will be in the top right corner right now and in the description of the video. With all of that out of the way, let's sink our teeth into this juicy topic. If sex and death are constants, so is a tendency to equate them. Vampirism is inherently sexual, and one can easily draw parallels between sucking blood and, well, other fluids. Fanged fiends hunt at night, and the oh-so cruel act of biting a victim follows the typical conventions regarding physical intimacy, something that we can see in a lot of the modern-day vampire imagery.
I find sex to be scary. So it's just like, when I listen to songs about sex, I want to be a little bit scared. What was I talking about? Oh yeah!
As Tracy puts it when talking about 19th century fiction, the vampire's combination of death and sexual activity brings one of the 19th century major public preoccupations: death, the dead, funerals, tombs, together with its major private and secret preoccupation, sex and sexuality. One could be talked about and celebrated incessantly. The other could not be talked about at all, except by thus combining it with death and so disguising it. The vampire story supplies a metaphoric vocabulary to represent certain obsessions and anxieties not otherwise admissible into literature. One of the most talked about examples of Victorian fiction dealing with these topics, Dracula by Bram Stoker, has been subject to analysis for over a century now, with the scholarship focusing on a broad variety of aspects of the novel, from the class and race coding and relations to the image of the so-called new woman and the influence of anti-Semitic stereotypes on the way vampires are coded and perceived. We are, of course, going to focus on the sex of it all. An important caveat I feel is needed here is the note that Count Dracula himself is transgressive in terms of gender. As a man, he can give birth by way of turning others into his vampire children, and shares more qualities with Mina and Lucy than he does with any of the men in the novel. At the same time, the character reflects a lot of the anti-Semitic stereotypes about Jewish men. He's a hook-nosed predator who corrupts the pure Christian women. Dracula sucks the blood out of countless innocent people. That, as noted by Weinstock, is reminiscent of the familiar derogatory metaphor of the blood-sucking, money-lending Jew. That is not to say that Bram Stoker intentionally coded the character this way, or that all depictions of vampires are inherently anti-Semitic, but ignoring the established bond between the two would be reductive, especially considering that Dracula is at the root of a huge chunk of vampire media, and the movies at hand specifically. More to that, in the novel, the portrayal of Romani people follows the tradition of depicting them as these simple, superstition-believing thieves who happily work for the forces of pure evil when given the tiniest amount of gold. The stereotype is sadly alive and well even in modern media. For more info, I recommend you check out Florian, an actual Romani educator who approaches this topic with a lot more nuance than I ever could. Around the same time as the novel was being finished and published in the 1890s, a fresh feminist concept emerged, the so-called New Woman, who was transgressing gender roles and doing other outrageous things, such as riding bicycles and going to college. So, naturally, a lot of contemporary works of literature dealt with the topic, Dracula being one of them. The two female characters in the main cast, Lucy and Mina, have been analyzed through the lens of the New Woman by many researchers, with some arguing whether one or the other fits the definition at all. One's interpretation depends on one's opinion on the concept as a whole, as well as the work being examined. Not even to mention that the depiction of the New Woman within the narrative is entirely dependent on the author's take on the issue. There isn't a one true correct reading, as with all things media and media related, but the one I find most interesting and relevant to our debate was offered by Blazevich in The Improper New Woman of Bram Stoker's Dracula. Can you hear him purr? They posit that both of the heroines are new women, but filtered through different tropes of Victorian women. Namely, Mina is the angel in the house, whereas Lucy is the fallen woman. Mina is devoted to her fiancé, passive and submissive. She fits neatly into the mold heavily influenced by the Christian ideals and embodies a pure, caring motherly figure. Despite being an active participant in, and the key to, destroying Dracula, at the end of the novel, when all is said and done, Mina is only described as a mother. At the same time, she displays traits typical for the New Woman. She practices shorthand and has worked as a schoolmistress before getting married to Jonathan. Lucy, unlike Mina, is represented more heavily in terms of her physical attributes. Her attractiveness is reiterated throughout the novel by both Mina and multiple gentlemen callers. Lucy, when proposed to by different men, says, "Why can't they let a girl marry 3 men, or as many as want her, and save all this trouble?" And continuing the blood and other bodily fluids parallel, get blood transfusions from multiple men after being bitten by Dracula. She's also way more predisposed to becoming an undead, not only struggling with complying to Victorian ideals of propriety, but also being a sleepwalker, something that can be seen as her being coded as either a sex worker or a literal creature of the night. As Senf argues, Lucy's sleepwalking state reveals her second, more unhinged nature, and ultimately leads to her becoming a vampire. By day, Lucy remains an acquiescent and loving Victorian girl. By night, the other side of her character gains control. It is this restlessness which ultimately leads her to Dracula and to emancipation from her society's restraints. The two, despite both falling victims to Dracula, behave differently in their vampirism. Lucy turns into a vicious creature that drains kids of their blood, described in even more sexual and physical terms than earlier in the novel. Mina's vampirism, on the other hand, does not take on a violent form. Her connection to Dracula is more spiritual and profound, with her being able to literally get into his head, something that Lucy is never indicated to be able to do. This aspect is brought to the surface in the 1992 movie Bram Stoker's Dracula, where the relationship between Mina and Dracula is depicted as a romance outside of the confines of vampiric urges, whereas that between Lucy and Dracula is pointedly sexual. The two different blood-sucking roads lead to two different blood-sucking ends. Mina is avenged by the group and retains her humanity all throughout the story, whereas the narrative surrounding Lucy switches up quite fast. At the point where her fiancé drives a wooden stake through her heart, the narration refers to her as it, the thing, and the body, rather than using her name or just saying she. When examining both of the women's interaction with Dracula, parallels to sexual encounters can be drawn easily. Now, one can read those as liberating and consensual, like Sanf does with Lucy, but an argument can also be made for a more unsettling reading that views the vampire attacks as a possible metaphor for SA. In their thesis entitled "You May As Well Be Quiet: Sexual Assault in Bram Stoker's Dracula," Magdalene Felix explores the episodes evoking those parallels for three characters: Lucy, Mina, and Jonathan, who's nearly assaulted by Dracula's brides during his stay in the Count's castle. Moreover, the very act of killing a vampire within the novel, staking them, is, as Felix notes, undeniably phallic. As the author goes on to explain in the case of Lucy, she is penetrated by her fiancé, the closest to a consummation of their relationship that they get. After she is dead, Van Helsing and Dr. Seward cut off her head and fill her mouth with garlic. Not only is this sin incredibly grim, but it highlights the objectification of Lucy. Another aspect that I feel is very important to our analysis is this sort of triangle that's going on between Dracula, Mina, and Jonathan. Dracula claims Jonathan as his own when the brides try to prey on him. I mean, he literally says, "How dare you touch him, any of you? How dare you cast eyes on him when I had forbidden it? Back, I tell you all. This man belongs to me. Beware how you meddle with him, or you'll have to deal with me." Similarly, if we circle back to that point about the bloodsucker's connection to Mina being more profound and spiritual than that to Lucy, one can argue that the Count displays vampiric attraction and lust towards both Mina and Jonathan. As Janet Bergstrom rightfully notes in their analysis of the 1922 Nosferatu film, which I'd say applies to Dracula as well, Nosferatu's desire for Jonathan is always mediated through Mina, just as his desire for Mina is mediated through Jonathan. I go into more detail regarding the novel in the Dracula section of the Bisexual Vampires video, so if you're interested in that, check it out. Highlighting the dichotomy of the image of the new woman, as well as the difference in treatment of Lucy and Mina, was, in my opinion, necessary due to the changes introduced to the main cast of characters in the 1922 Murnau film, which, as theorized by many, was partly done for copyright reasons. The 1922 film Nosferatu, directed by Friedrich Wilhelm Murnau, was, as the title cards themselves state, an adaptation of Dracula, an unauthorized one at that. Count Dracula turns into Count Orlok, Jonathan Harker turns into Thomas Hatta, Mina becomes Ellen, sometimes referred to as Nina due to different versions of the movie existing. Renfield is now Herr Knock. Practically all secondary male characters get smushed into one singular Harding. Lucy is now Harding's sister by the name of Ruth, and Professor Bulwer replaces Dr. Van Helsing. The action is also moved to Wisborg, a fake German city, which some versions of the film refer to as Bremen. The main story beats are there, though reduced to accommodate for the smaller cast. Thomas goes to Transylvania to sell a house to a local nobleman who turns out to be a vampire. Then they two try to outrun each other on the way back. Orlok is then defeated by the main cast. Bonus, he brought some rats and plague from home. Obviously, we cannot get into Murnau's head, but the overall consensus among those interested in the movie is that the changes we see in the main cast of characters were implemented either A, in order to avoid accusations of copyright infringement, or B, because it was a low-budget German movie made with German audiences in mind, so foreign names and places might have felt out of place, or alternatively, C, both. But whatever the case might have been, Stoker's widow, Florence, sued the creators on the grounds of them not clearing the adaptation with her. Now, somehow the narrative surrounding that woman often takes on a form of she tried to destroy the film, whereas if we look at the circumstances of her life, they suggest a different motive. Florence Stoker, a widow of an author whose fame and recognition would only arrive decades later, was after monetary retribution. Being a woman in the early 20th century England did not exactly provide one with an opportunity to go and clock in at the nearest retail job. And it was a clear-cut case. The movie literally admits to having been based on her deceased husband's work. After years of legal battle, multiple screenings, and the company that produced the film declaring bankruptcy, Stoker realized that no royalty checks were likely to hit her bank account. So she requested the movie to be destroyed instead. It actually survived, and the allure of a forbidden and illegal movie drew more audiences in. Yada yada, you know the story. What was lost for a long time, however, was the original score of the film. Although not played at all screenings, Edman's score was written specifically for the movie. Edman and Becca have reported that before completing his films, Murnau used to discuss the music with the composers. Edman arranged his Nosferatu score as a suite which he called Fantastische Romantische Suite, which was published in two arrangements, one for full orchestra and one for palm chord orchestra. There is a version that combines two of the elements crucial to the viewing experience, the colors and the music, available on YouTube. I will put a link to it in the description. With these two mini rants out of the way, we can really get into it. Nina Auerbach posits that vampires, similarly to other creatures, are always indicative of the society that created them. Well, not only Nina Auerbach does that, but it's their name that comes to mind first. The point is, the bloodsuckers do not exist in a vacuum, and Murnau's vampire count is indicative of post-war Germany. The country's defeat in the war and the end of traditional monarchic rule, as well as the perceived threat and influence of Bolshevism, came together to maximize their joint slay and create an atmosphere so shaky and stressful that the average Joe, or the average Johannes, was seeking an escape from the grim realities of a collapsing currency and the rise of the reactionary political powers which skewed heavily to the right. And so came Expressionism, which Manuel and Frenkel describe as a movement designed to get away from actuality and to satisfy the desire to probe seemingly fundamental truths of human nature and society by presenting them through fantasy and dramatized mysticism. The vampire, being a creature of great caliber when it comes to all things mystic yet reflective of society, is simply a perfect subject for a movement focused on moving away from everyday reality while focusing on the emotional side of things. For instance, in his Vanity Fair interview, Rolf Giesen, the author of the Nosferatu story, notes that the monster might have had a closer connection to the war, specifically in his appearance and his, for a lack of a better term, pets. His companions come from the trenches of the First World War, the rats. Nosferatu was also a kind of war veteran. Back then, the streets were full of horribly disfigured, wounded war veterans. Someone like Orlok was not an isolated case after the war. More to that, Count Orlok's resemblance of the anti-Semitic stereotypes we've discussed earlier are often noted, despite, to my knowledge, no evidence pointing to anti-Semitic views being held by Murnau. Whether that was the intention or not, one must acknowledge the parallels that are inevitably drawn in the context of the rise of far-right powers in the country and of anti-Semitic stereotypes portraying Jewish people as bringing plague and the Jewish-coded vampire, literally bringing plague to a small and idyllic German city. The story itself differentiates quite a lot from the original novel it was aiming to adapt. Namely, it strips away a lot of the characters and, therefore, the dynamics we observe in their interaction. Our main cast is now limited to Ellen, Thomas, and Count Orlok. Herr Knock, who is the stand-in for Renfield, as well as Professor Bulva, the movie's Dr. Van Helsing, both do not play nearly as important of a role in the film as they do in the book. But potentially the most striking difference that really stands out to any modern-day viewer is the appearance of the Count. As renowned film critic Roger Ebert puts it, the vampire should come across not like a flamboyant actor, but like a man suffering from a dread curse. Shrek plays the Count more like an animal than a human being. Nosferatu, unlike many vampires we see in the media, especially those created from the second half of the 20th century onwards, does not seem to possess that fanged allure and sensuality. He's terrifying and does not resemble the irresistible beasts we're used to. It was actually Max Schreck's scary getup that got the little guy named Robert Eggers interested in the movie. which ultimately led to the 2024 remake, but more on that later. I've referred to Ellen as this movie's version of Mina, but that is not entirely true. She combines the traits of both female characters of the original. While being a devoted wife to Thomas Hutter, like Mina, Ellen resembles Lucy when it comes to her sleepwalking, and arguably more willing connection to the Count. She also displays more initiative and goes so far as to lie to her husband, something that seems unthinkable in the context of her book counterpart, in order to save the city. Within the narrative, her relationship with the undead also starts earlier than Mina's in the book, which is more reminiscent of Lucy's implied connection to the darker world. The Count, upon seeing a locket that Thomas carries with Ellen's picture inside, exhibits interest in the young lady, exclaiming, "Your wife has a lovely neck." Richard McCormick puts it the following way: "Not only does Nosferatu have a vision of Ellen while still in Transylvania that makes him desire her, but Ellen seems to desire Nosferatu long before he arrives in Visborg." Van Helsing's de facto absence from this version adds a further layer of change to Ellen's character and the overall story. Starting with the latter, the way to defeat Nosferatu in the movie is a pure woman becoming a willing sacrifice by offering herself to the vampire, as is stated in the book that Thomas finds at the inn he is staying at on his way to Orlok's castle at the beginning of the movie. This way, the very act of defeating the bloodsucker, in the words of Lane Roth, is accomplished by feminine surrender in the film, unlike the male attack that finished the Count off in the original novel. If we turn our attention to the book about vampires mentioned earlier and think it over for just a second, a reasonable question arises. If the knowledge that a pure lady offering herself to the vampire is what it takes to kill him, wouldn't Orlok be aware of that too? As Hensley posits in their analysis of the film, it would therefore be imperative that Dracula avoid such a woman at all costs. Assuming for a moment that at least part of the secret to Dracula's longevity was his prudence, the logical course of action would be for him to choose only children and or males as his victims. Why would he ever bother with female victims? Well, it's because Ellen is not like the other damsels. Here's where we circle back to the connection between the vampire and the heroine being strengthened by the changes implemented to the story and cast of characters. The film strongly suggests that the Count's fascination with Ellen transcends simple vampiric lust, that there is something else drawing him to her, namely romantic attraction. That attraction is not portrayed to be reciprocated by Ellen in any way other than her sleepwalking and mind connection to the vampire. As Murnau himself clarified in regards to the scene of Ellen letting Dracula drink from her, Nosferatu raises his head. He looks drunk with pleasure. Ellen's eyes are full of terrible fear. She must not allow Nosferatu just to go. She puts her arms around him. He cannot resist and bends his head over her again. Thus, despite occupying the space of both Lucy and Mina within the narrative, Ellen is not portrayed as someone crossing the lines of Victorian propriety. Arguably, she's not depicted as a sexual being at all. It is the Count who could be read as a representation of sexuality as a whole, as argued by Robin Wood. Examining the movie in regards to repression of sexuality, he points out that the Count, who is sexuality personified, must be defeated via being eliminated from the narrative. Janet Bergstrom points out the fact that Wood claims that Nosferatu's antagonist is Thomas and argues instead that it is Ellen who is the vampire's double. In a highly ambiguous gesture where she seems both to need and to repudiate sexuality in Nosferatu, she attracts and keeps the vampire with her until the cock crows at dawn. As per their further argument, while the bloodsucker's desire for Ellen is still always mediated through Thomas and vice versa, the two characters in this installment do not fall as far apart on the masculine-feminine spectrum. While Ellen has certain feminine attributes, she is ethereal and physical, progressively more fragile and ill, Thomas has others. The unnatural kiss that the vampire finally gives Ellen, that kills both of them, is initially given to Thomas, who serves as a substitute. His body offers no resistance, even in his fright when the vampire enters his bedroom. Thomas's acquiescence, no matter how unknowing or unwilling in narrative terms, nourishes the vampire. and the attitudes his body repeatedly adopts could be termed feminine. He is frequently made to step slowly backwards and then drape himself across a chair, a bed, or some other piece of the decor. Thus, through stripping the story down and altering some of the main cast, Murnau has also inverted some of the dynamics present in the original novel. It is no longer the group of men who defeat the vampire, and the substitutes for sexuality that led to Lucy and Mina becoming victims have been turned into a weapon used by Alan against Nosferatu, for it is he who cannot resist her lure and not the other way around. While Thomas is still relatively front and center in the story, just like Jonathan was, Ellen is implied to have more agency and is the one to ultimately defeat Orlok. The link between vampirism and sexuality takes on a more obvious form, rising to the surface. Yet, at the same time, the physical violence seen in the acts of biting and staking gives way to a psychological one. The vampire of the story is more reminiscent of the way Dracula is described at the beginning of the novel. He's closer to being an animal or an animated corpse than the very human-like bloodsuckers that possess that undead allure. Nevertheless, the connection, and arguably attraction, although very faint, between Nosferatu, Alan, and Thomas persists and remains instrumental to the story. And over half a century later, the same dreadful creature would come back to the silver screens. Do I even have more candles? Yes, I do. This is also the goblet that I usually drink out of, but I broke it. The 1979 Nosferatu the Vampire, directed by Werner Herzog, was described by Roger Ebert as a film haunted by the earlier one. And it was, not only in the sense of it being a remake, but also guided by the director's love for Weimar cinema and the 1922 film in particular.
Nosferatu, in my opinion, is the most important film ever made in Germany. So this is some sort of a challenge. And it establishes some sort of a link between the great expressionist cinema that we had in Germany and our film renaissance now. It is a film that is beyond my own private person, and I think it is necessary, since we are a fatherless generation, to have some sort of a continuity in film history.
The film Renaissance that Herzog is referring to is the slow recovery that German cinema was going through in the 1960s and 70s, after the country lost a lot of its creative minds and freedom of expression in the arts and media during the rule of the Nazi Party. Nosferatu the Vampire is, in a way, a reckoning and a way to connect two quite dark moments in Germany's history and art.
Werner Herzog is the first to point out that his is not a remake of Nosferatu, but a rebirth of the 1922 Murnau film. Unstinting in his praise of that early film, he says, Murnau's Nosferatu is the most visionary of all German films. It prophesied the rise of Nazism by showing the invasion of Germany by Dracula and his plague-bearing rats. We are trying to build a thin bridge back to that time, to legitimize our own culture and cinema.
And the 57 years that divide them could not have passed without leaving a mark on both society and the way it deals with art. The movie transforms the already transformed story even further. Firstly, it uses the original name from the novel. Thomas is back to being Jonathan, Count Orlok is Count Dracula yet again, Herr Knock reverts back to Renfield, and so on. If the background doesn't match up, that's because I knocked down my fucking tripod while I was waiting for my camera to cool down, so you can blame Sonny for that, honestly. The fictional city of Wisborg turns into a real one, Wismar, even though it was the Dutch city of Delft that served as the production lot due to its idyllic and dreamy look. And also because Werner Herzog couldn't get clearance for Wismar, so, you know, he was doing his best. Werner Herzog, of course, was free to use the original names due to the novel being in the public domain at the time of the remake's release, and most of them mirror the characters that served as prototypes for the 1922 film. The heroine, however, is of particular interest to us, Ellen's name gets changed to Lucy and not Mina, and to suggest that it was random is to not give credit to how much of a Nosferatu fan Werner Herzog is. Whereas Ellen in the original movie is a mix of Mina and Lucy, the director of the 1979 version shows clearly which side she leans towards. Lucy, just like her book counterpart, is connected to the Count even before they meet. Something that was implied in the 1922 film is elevated to a whole new level in the 1979 one. The movie shows Lucy and the Count being able to communicate, albeit not clearly, at a great distance. It is reiterated via bats that often follow and/or torment Lucy. None of the Nosferatu bloodsuckers turn into bats, but the imagery surrounding vampires, as well as the novel at the very foundation of the movie, have established a strong link between the two. We see bats in Dracula's castle, and it is particularly interesting to note that when Jonathan is writing Lucy a letter, there are two bats observing him. Thus, despite the fact that this version's Dracula gets obsessed with Lucy after seeing her portrait, much like Murnau's vampire, narratively, it feels more like an element that adds onto the already existing relationship rather than a starting point. Additionally, Herzog's Lucy is also quite different from Murnau's wide-eyed Ellen, and even though they both ultimately defeat the vampire, the 1971 heroine is much stronger in her conviction to do it, even heading to the vampire's lair herself in order to disrupt his hideout, the soil he was originally buried in, aka the soil that gives him power and that he brought with himself on the journey to Visma. She also traps her husband via creating a circle out of sacred wafer so that he cannot interfere in her sacrifice. Short note here. This movie contains much more Catholic imagery than the original Nosferatu, and it is Catholic iconography that helps deter and defeat a vampire. Another development that we see in this version is a more established relationship between Lucy and Jonathan. Their love for one another is made more evident. For instance, through an additional scene of them taking a walk together after Lucy pleads with Jonathan to not leave right away. The letter he writes to her while in Dracula's castle is also more expressive and intense. Similarly, Lucy is more open with her feelings towards her husband, and the small additional scenes or details make their relationship feel stronger than that depicted in the 1922 version. As Proller puts it in the book on this installment of the classic, between Murnau's Nosferatu and Herzog's film lies the most disgraceful period of German history. The murder and complicity in murder of millions of people born into the wrong religious or race, with sexual orientations, mental handicaps, or nomadic dispositions that made them unfit to be part of the new order, or with political beliefs other than those officially decreed. Dracula deals largely with the themes of otherness. Nosferatu serves as the ultimate outsider. And it's not only the change we can observe in the portrayal of vampires in the second half of the 20th century, but also the history of oppression against and persecution of people who fell into the category of the other that impacted art in post-World War II Germany, and Dracula's portrayal in the 1979 film specifically. Dracula, as depicted by Herzog, is not the same animal-like predator driven by bloodlust. The Count is introspective and much more human despite his appearance. As Herzog himself says in A Guide for the Perplexed, in Murnau's film, the creature is frightening because he has no soul and looks like an insect. But Kinski's vampire has a real existential anguish. I tried to humanize him by presenting the vampire as an agonized, sad, and lonely creature, desperately thirsty for love, but terrifying at the same time. I wanted to endow him with human suffering, with a true longing for love, and importantly, the one essential capacity of human beings, mortality. Herzog's Dracula is struggling with his own nature, as evident by the scene where Jonathan cuts his finger and the Count tries to hold back, but is unable to do so. At the same time, if we take the sexually charged nature of vampirism discussed in the previous sections into account, the same scene takes on a darker tone, with something as seemingly innocuous, by vampire metrics, of course, as drinking someone's blood from their finger can be read as sexual assault. Orlok from the 1922 movie seems to be driven exclusively by vampiric instincts and urges, and he has no reservations about drinking from Jonathan, whereas the 1979 Dracula tries to wrestle with this drive. Moreover, the scene is more overtly violent in the 1979 installment, and therefore has I would argue, a stronger emotional impact on both Jonathan and the overall story. The Count also fails to stop himself from drinking out of Jonathan's neck during the night, a detail that is present in the 1922 version as well, but gets recontextualized in this one, suggesting Jonathan in particular being irresistible in the Count's eyes, and establishing their connection and relationship, which is not as overtly present in Murnau's film. Dracula here is not just a monster, but a tragic monster cursed by his very nature. He is much more existential and even confides in Jonathan and Lucy, speaking of how he yearns to be human more than anything.
Time is an abyss, profound as 1,000 nights. Centuries come and go. To be unable to grow old is terrible. Death is not the worst. There are things more horrible than death.
This Dracula is not only fascinated by Lucy and Jonathan, but also by their relationship, something he outright tells Lucy.
I wish I could partake of the love which is between you and Jonathan.
This very moment serves to further develop and explore the often unbalanced triangle we're focusing on here, and it points to Dracula being attracted to the love and bond between Lucy and Jonathan, rather than to any of them individually. Upon seeing Lucy's portrait in a locket, he makes the same comment about her neck as the 1922 Nosferatu, but he also cradles it in his hands with care, as if it were something fragile and precious. The Count also further confirms that it is love he's after and trying to get when he says the following when Lucy rejects him.
The absence of love is the most abject pain.
I would argue that even though this new dimension given to Dracula adds certain character depth and turns him into a tragic anti-hero, it does not negate the possibility of reading his actions as allegory for sexual assault and torment. He haunts Lucy's dreams and does not accept her initial rejection. He practically jumps on Jonathan at the first sight of his blood. Moreover, he bites Jonathan multiple times without his knowing, which results in the character being turned into a vampire. At the same time, one of the final scenes, Lucy's sacrifice, may point to a different interpretation. As Proler describes it, Dracula's ultimate encounter with Lucy is a night of love, on a bed strewn with rose petals, signs of tenderness and orgiastic sighs emitting from both partners. I personally see the rose petals and a more suggestive atmosphere as Lucy trying to convince Dracula that it is love he partakes in, the one he finds so irresistible and desirable. But all these elements that point to an alternative reading, one that views this act as Lucy's liberation through defying Victorian norms, or even as an act of love, are, as I've mentioned, present in the narrative. For instance, you could look at how timid and careful Dracula appears to be in the scene, and with Lucy in particular. Finally, the death of the Count is much more violent than that in the Murnau film, as noted, again, by Proler. The death he dies is not the dissolution into a puff of smoke, like Murnau's Orlok, but an authentically human death, with blindness, convulsion, pain, and an indrawing of breath as though sucking what Rilke called a great death into himself. This seems to correspond with the higher level of violence we encounter throughout the movie. For instance, even though it happens off-screen, Van Helsing drives a stake through Dracula in order to keep the vampire dead, an attempt that ultimately ends up being futile, seeing as Jonathan and Renfield carry on the monster's legacy and doings. The stake, inherently phallic as mentioned before, is once again evocative of sexual violence and violation, this time weaponized against the vampire himself. The 1979 version, as rightfully pointed out by its director, is not simply a remake, but a reimagining different due to not only Herzog's unique take on the monster, but the influence of historical events as well. Dracula is most similar to Nosferatu in his appearance, but where the latter is driven by his vampiric lust, the former tries to wrestle against it and yearns for love. At the same time, violence, and imagery suggesting sexual violence in particular, has more of a presence in this version of the story, thus making Dracula a multifaceted monster with more character depth than we could see in Murnau's Nosferatu. Lucy and Jonathan's relationship, as well as the relationships between both of them and the Count, take on a more explicit nature and become more intense in Herzog's take on the story. Speaking of things becoming more intense, the 2024 version of Nosferatu, directed by Robert Eggers.
You must bounce on it. Crazy style.
As the director mentioned in multiple interviews, he's been a fan of Murnau's film ever since he was a child.
I saw Nosferatu for the first time when I was 9 years old. You know, I was very impressed with Max Schreck's performance and the haunting atmosphere. And, you know, because I was watching it on a VHS that was made from a bad 16mm print, the whole thing kind of felt real. When I was 17, a friend of mine and I directed like a high school play of Nosferatu. A guy who ran a local theater company saw it and invited us to do a more professional version of it at his theater. And that changed my life and cemented the fact that I wanted to be a director. And since then, Nosferatu's been sort of like a big part of my identity as someone who is endeavoring to make creative work.
And it's the 1922 film he is sharing his take on, not the 1979 Herzog remake. However, Eggers also claims that it was his goal to reimagine and redefine the story instead of remaking the film bit for bit, to the point where he was opposed to using the same locations and only agreed to it when the crew ran out of options.
So then we scouted like tons more castles and they all sucked. And the location manager was like, look, dude, like Bernstein Castle is the castle that looks like right for the movie. You just have to suck it up. So then we went to the castle again. And on the way back, I was scrubbing through Werner Herzog's Nosferatu and realized that the places that we wanted to use weren't in the Herzog film. So we were able to use the castle, tip our hat to Herzog, but not shoot it the same way.
Since the 2024 version is based on the Murnau film and not any other takes on Dracula, Eggers chooses Visborg over Wismar, or Bremen, or any other city for that matter. The majority of the names also do not come from the public domain version. We're back to Ellen, Thomas, and Orlok. But with an additional hour of runtime, the cast of characters was bound to get bigger. There's Friedrich and Anna Harding, Thomas and Ellen's friends, who are comparably more well off. Seeing the difference in how the two couples live gives us a more solid foundation for why Thomas feels so compelled to take on these questionable jobs in order to make a hefty commission and improve life for himself and his wife. There are also two doctors who treat Ellen, Albin Eberhard von Franz, who is closer to Dracula's Van Helsing, and Dr. Wilhelm Sievers, who has a more grounded, it's just somnambulism approach. As Eggers himself said, exploring the characters in order to get a grasp on them was crucial to him. I wrote a novella as I was breaking the script, to enrich the backstories of the characters and their relationships in order to make it my own. Since I found that it's gotten better, it's gotten sharper, but it has pretty much stayed the same thing, where it is very much Ellen's story about a woman who is as much a victim of 19th century society as she is of the vampire, and this demon-lover relationship she has with Orlok. And I do have to admit that to me, the characters in this version feel the most compelling and well-defined. Even in comparison to the 1979 version, the love between Ellen and Thomas is established scene after scene through a myriad of details, from their open dialogue to Ellen putting her hair into the locket so that she can be with her husband even as he's away. I've already mentioned how Murnau's film flips the original dynamic on its head and makes Ellen the protagonist and the heroine. Same is true for the 2024 version, except it is an overt thing within the narrative, unlike more subtle inversions of the previous installments.
It's definitely told through Ellen's eyes, which I think is so cool because it's a perspective that we haven't seen before in you know, Nosferatus of the past, and so I was really excited about that.
It's important for me to note this fact, the story being told from Ellen's point of view, since we do not only get a further exploration of her as a character, but also partly shift the focus from external to internal conflicts. Specifically, the fact that she feels at odds with the Victorian society, which, if we talk about the original novel, is reminiscent of Lucy. Similarly, she's also portrayed as more of a sexual being than the 1922 Ellen, the 1979 Lucy, and Dracula's Mina. In the words of Eggers himself, Thomas thinks he's the hero, but really his wife, who everyone is calling crazy and telling to shut up and tying to bed, is the only one who can solve the problem. That's much more interesting. People surrounding Ellen see her as sick and improper. Dr. Sievers diagnoses her with somnambulism and ignores all signs that point to the root of the issue being rather preternatural. It is von Franz, the movie's Van Helsing. Should I be saying von Franz? Because like Von Dutch is the way that Americans pronounce it. Honestly, if you get it, you get it. If you do not, you do not. It is von Franz, this movie's Van Helsing, who first suggests something outside of the realm of normalcy is at play. More to that, he is the first human to truly see Ellen and recognize her nature.
In retrospect, when I think about my character's relationship with Ellen, it's kind of beautiful because he's the one that sees her. Nobody else sees her.
Through that, another conflict not evident in the first two installments of the story gets brought to the surface. While love Ellen and Thomas feel for one another is undeniably strong, Hutter is unable to understand and feel this aspect of his wife's life and dismisses, even if not pointedly, a lot of her concerns. He's not shown to be neglectful in any way. The story instead points to him simply not being able to comprehend Ellen's feelings and visions. When it comes to Orlok, the last main character, he is definitely closer to Murnau's version than to Herzog's. We do not get a single monologue on the trials and tribulations of being multiple centuries old and alone, and the Count's overall appearance was specifically meant to be as repulsive as possible. He's a half-rotten, disfigured corpse with long, pointy claws that are begging for a buffer and a topcoat. His voice is terrifying, and for most of the film, he's kept in the shadows, being all the more scary since it's your imagination at play when he's concealed. As mentioned throughout a lot of interviews, Eggers was set on bringing an actual dead Transylvanian count to the screen, and the team working on the film did a lot of research in order to get away from the tropes of vampire portrayal. That's why Orlok, while resembling his earlier version, does have elements grounded in history, like his mustache and hair. Off topic, but another difference from the 1979 version specifically is the treatment of animals on set. The biologist working on Herzog's production was horrified with the mistreatment of animals, who were submerged into literal boiling water because their fur color didn't align with the director's vision, among other things. So he ended up making the whole ordeal public. I'll put the link to that in the description if you want to read it, but you know, it's a lot. The current day remake also became notorious for its use of rats, though for better reasons.
Yeah, and they're incontinent rats, which, so it was kind of stinky. Luckily, I didn't have, I had to wade through...
They're not incontinent, they just
don't care.
Why would they care?
I love that you're offended.
I'll hold it.
I heard someone else say they were incontinent. It sounded smart. You're right. They're just rats. They're just peeing poo. Yeah.
As production designer Craig Lathrop shared with Variety, the rats, none of them were lost. We found all of them. They were all there. We built these plexiglass barriers so that the live rats would be in a controlled area. In the scene on the street, the horses are on one side of the plexiglass barrier and the rats are on the other, so that the rats wouldn't run underneath their feet and get squashed, so nobody would get hurt. Now that the rat question is out of the way, let's get back to what we are actually discussing here, the intricacies of the relationships between Orlok, Thomas, and Ellen, and the depiction of the link between vampirism and sexuality. When it comes to the overall level of open sexuality in the story, it gets intentionally brought up to the surface of the narrative. Here's what Eggers said in regards to why vampires continue to be fascinating to us, mortals.
I mean, it's just a perfect combination of sex and death, you know?
The very acts of vampirism in the movie are sexual, yet not erotic. They are unsettling and violent, like for instance the scene of Orlok assaulting Thomas. It is also important to note that Orlok's attitude towards Thomas is closer to the one we see in the 1922 film. His attraction to Hutter is rather that of a predator pursuing prey than, say, the fascination with the man we see in the original novel or the yearning for love in the 1979 movie. While it still holds true that the Count's attraction to Ellen is mediated through Thomas and vice versa, Ellen's connection to vampirism is undisputably stronger, even though I do have to note there is the whole thing of the Count insisting that Thomas only refers to him as Lord. But, you know, you could apply a lot of readings to that, and this is not the focus of this video, and I didn't want this video to be 3 hours long. In order to heighten the parallel we've been exploring in this video, Eggers also turns to the historical links between the topics. For instance, in the scene of the ritual that Thomas encounters on the way to Orlok's castle. Here, for example, is what Corvus Nocturnum mentions in Vampire Evolution, from myth to modern day. There were a variety of methods used to find the graves of vampires in Europe. One example, as told by author Paul Barber in Vampires, Burial and Death, was that a virgin was placed naked on a white horse and paraded through a graveyard. If the horse refused to walk over a particular grave, the body in that grave was immediately exhumed and destroyed. This is also the reason why the movie's vampire drinks from the chest of his victims and not their necks, like in the earlier versions.
The thing of biting in the neck is a total Hollywood invention, because really, when people believe, they bit in the chest, which he kind of embraced because it's more poetic, because it's near the heart.
Similarly, Ellen's fits, one that's skewed more towards fear and worry in the previous installments, are a mix of, well, climaxing and being possessed in the 2024 film. The fits, which are shown to have started back when Ellen was a child, come back to haunt her when Orlok first decides to contact the firm Thomas works for. Thus, her connection to the Count stretches back in time. Something that was implied in the earlier versions is once again made overt and therefore transformed into a more influential part of the narrative. An approach that we can see all throughout the movie. When it comes to Ellen's relationship with Orlok, it stems from her not fitting into Victorian society. As the beginning of the movie shows it, Ellen seeks companionships in a moment of desperation, but it ends up being the Count who responds to her. As a young, lonely girl with psychically sensitive powers and a recently deceased mother, Ellen reached into the void, looking for company anywhere she could find it. Nobody understands this part of Ellen. Well, nobody other than von Franz, who comes into the picture way too late and is not taken seriously by other characters until shit really starts hitting the fan. Thus, despite Orlok terrorizing her ever since she was a child, he's her only partner in the realm that's inaccessible to all others.
Her husband loves her, she loves her husband, but he can't get this side of her, so she's being called mad and melancholic and hysteric because this stuff is repressed and like bubbling up. Unfortunately, the one person who can understand this side of her is a demon, is a vampire, is Orlok.
The imagery surrounding Orlok and Ellen's interactions is evocative of abuse and sexual assault. The woman's been haunted by this all-powerful demon ever since she was young, manipulated and hunted down by him. Take, for instance, the very condition that she has to willingly give herself up to the vampire, who gives her 3 nights to decide and promises to kill everyone she loves, starting with her friend Anna and ending with her husband Thomas, if she rejects him. In their piece on Nosferatu, McAndrews goes into detail about the patterns that they saw in both the undead Transylvanian Count and their own abuser. And I recommend reading it in full, but one quote stuck out to me in particular. His vampiric influence from thousands of miles away is reminiscent of my own abuser's relentless attempts to gaslight me into staying. Streams of text messages after our breakup claimed that I could never stay away, that we were meant to be together, that he never believed I had the courage to truly end our relationship. I was mandated to call him every day at a certain time or I'd be berated for being selfish. No matter where I went, he could find me, whether that meant showing up unexpectedly at my college or calling me until I'd pick up. His words made me want to tear at my clothes, my hair, my skin. They made me want to scream in rage as I couldn't quite figure out why I didn't just block his number and move on. No matter how much he made me cry, I stayed and listened. It felt safer than truly leaving. He wore me down to a shell of a human being. It was all I knew, just as Orlok's voice is all Ellen knew. Eggers himself refers to Orlok in this way.
And unfortunately, the one person before she meets you who does see that is a demon. He's a vampire and he's an abuser.
He's coming.
This topic, while being present throughout the entire film, does not cross the line into sexploitation. As noted by Severino, in every scene, Eggers reminds his viewers how Ellen is tormented by Orlok. Every aspect of horror in Nosferatu, from Orlok's eerie powers to the rats carrying plague, to the scene of necrophilia, can be linked back to this metaphor of sexual violence. In the same article, the author points to the line Ellen utters when talking about the Count to her husband. She says that Orlok is her shame. While many interpret it in the way that we'll move on to discussing shortly, their take on the shame is that it stems from Ellen's trauma because of her assault. In their own words, if Orlok is a representation of sexual assault and shame, then the only way for Ellen to destroy him is to face him head-on. Similarly, the topic of vampirism and sexual violence gets explored through the other characters as well. I've already briefly mentioned Orlok's attack on Thomas. There's also Anna Harding, who gets bitten by Orlok and then dies. Her husband Friedrich is then found lying on top of her in the crypt by von Franz, Dr. Sievers, and Thomas, who have come to execute her post-mortem. This episode of necrophilia is reminiscent of what happens to Lucy, who gets a stake through the heart by her fiancé, the very one that Felix referred to as the closest to a consummation of their relationship that they get. Similarly, this is the only sexual act we see in the life of the couple. Sex exists in the movie only in relation to vampirism, and even the scene between Ellen and Thomas closer to the end is connected to Orlok, as Ellen screams, "Let him see our love," in an attempt to prove to both herself and the Count that she is not defined by what he did to her, and that he yields no power over her. The very same scenes and elements, however, offer themselves up to a different interpretation, or rather, welcome some nuance. For instance, the actress portraying Ellen, Lily Rose Depp, says this about the relationship between the two.
It's a love story with Count Orlok as much as it is with her husband. There's a real love triangle there, and especially like my scenes with Bill. Rob wanted there to be like a palpable sensuality between the two characters.
Robert Eggers, the director of the movie, refers to the main dynamic as a love triangle.
And so you have this like kind of tragic demon lover story that is a love triangle about obsession and possession.
While it may be seen as negating the reading offered earlier, I would argue that the yearning Ellen and Orlok feel for each other also offers additional layers and additional nuance regarding the conversation surrounding abuse and sexual assault, depicting it as a complex issue that impacts both Ellen and Orlok and stems from their experiences and backstories, rather than an isolated incident that is not connected to any other aspects of their lives.
It makes things so much scarier. It's so much scarier to think that there is like a yearning going from, really between the two of them, rather than just like this woman who's kind of like chased down by this like scary demon that she like hates. She carries so much darkness within her, and I think that he, in a way, is like the manifestation of that darkness. And so she's pulled towards him for a reason.
The conversation surrounding Eggers' Nosferatu also focuses on another possible reading on the key relationship, namely the fact that Orlok is Ellen's shame because he represents her desire to get away from Victorian norms and the society that forces her into a mold she was definitely not meant to be in. Within this reading, then, the Count might be seen as a manifestation of sexuality and obsession, like in Murnau's version.
That is like the tragedy that it's only in this like incredibly toxic relationship that's a love story but really more about obsession. That's where she can find connection to this part of herself.
This part is Ellen's connection to the Count, which is represented through her visions and her outsiderness. Similarly to Lucy in Dracula, Ellen in the 2024 Nosferatu feels foreign to the very epoch she's living in, and it ultimately ends up being the reason for her demise.
A woman who's living in 19th century society, but she doesn't exist well there, and to see her, feeling alone, having these feelings and impressions and visions and things that she doesn't have language for, and no one understands her, and they're calling her hysteric, and the only person who can understand her is this demon lover, this vampire over here.
What is important to note is the key difference between the movie's Ellen and the book's Lucy. It's the fact that it is the heroine herself who is in charge of the resolution of the situation, and she's portrayed as having more agency than the book character. For instance, when Ellen recounts a dream/vision about the Count to her husband, she says,
"Standing before me, all in black, was death, but I'd never been so happy."
It is through embracing her shame and defying the social norms that she brings her suffering to an end, albeit dying in the process. Thus, in this version, it is sexuality that erases Victorian propriety from the narrative, unlike being successfully repressed and erased, like in Murnau's version. And this interpretation is easily picked up on by the audiences, even without probing too hard at the history of the topic. As Morris notes in their piece on the film, alas, after more than 2 hours of chomping, impaling, infanticide, and telepathy, I was so queasy with sympathy for all the sexual manipulation, so susceptible to it, that I'm ashamed to confess that I wanted my turn. So what is it? Is Orlog the representation of Victorian sexuality, or is he an abuser? The two readings largely contradict each other, and I'm not gonna hold your hand while I say this, because we are on the internet. But in the words of my best friend, who hates it when I engage in false dichotomies, two things can be true. After ruminating on my reading on the movie for a while, rewatching the previous versions and refreshing my Dracula knowledge, I can definitely see the arguments for both, and how certain moments lend themselves to multiple interpretations. I do still believe that takes along the lines of, "this is a dark romance that normies do not understand," are reductive and instead point to the author not understanding the material at hand, rather than the normies, and that due to the imagery reflecting the experience of SA victims, we need to maintain a certain level of nuance when discussing the story in order to remain respectful. Eggers' film is not only an interesting exploration of Murnau's classic, but an expansion on the story as well. The topic at hand, the link between vampirism and sex, is acknowledged openly by the director, and the use of overt sexual imagery feels well thought out and not gratuitous. Ellen, just like the character in the 1922 film, is a mix of Mina and Lucy, being connected to the Count both spiritually and sexually. And it is her who gets the most time in the spotlight, which furthers the changes initially brought to the story by Murnau. This Nosferatu and its reception, just like with the other versions, reflect the time the movie was created in. As put by Rolls, the conversation surrounding Eggers' Nosferatu is reflective of our current sexual culture and its nuance, complicated further by the storied history of vampires. Vampires and adjacent bloodsuckers, the fascinating undead, have existed in the human mind for millennia, and have been connected to sexuality for seemingly about as long. They are, of course, not limited to this topic and this topic only. The range these creatures have can only be envied, after all. Bram Stoker's Dracula, a novel incredibly rich in its themes and topics, definitely left a fang-shaped mark in the neck of vampire media. The unlicensed adaptation of Stoker's work in early 20th century Germany, which was not even supposed to survive due to the lawsuits filed by the author's widow, similarly turned out to be highly influential and has been haunting people around the world for over a century now, inspiring countless... get it? Countless? Whatever. Inspiring countless new spins on the same familiar story, which explore the topics initially brought up by Stoker through a contemporary lens, each being representative of both the time and the author's vision. Dracula has arguably truly become immortal, and Nosferatu has taken a life of its own. Horror is unlikely to stop existing anytime soon, due to the worldwide recession lurking around the corner, and the overall sense of impending doom that has been following humanity for forever. This particular genre has given us as a species space to explore things that might have been taboo or scary to approach head-on. And the nuanced conversations that we have regarding horror are important not only from a media and arts perspective, but as I'd argue, from a societal point of view too. In the words of Rawls, no matter how you slice it, Nosferatu is a film about sex, death, and shame, executed with a young woman at its center. How you interpret these taboo topics is deeply personal, but even before Eggers sank his teeth into the story, it was widely understood to be a somewhat loose adaptation of Bram Stoker's novel Dracula, which has sparked similar debate. Since I do not know how to finish this video, I'm going to be reading the trench coat meme in the thickest Slavic accent I can manage. Press like, subscribe, become a channel member, yada yada. You know, the YouTube algorithm-friendly drill. We approached them with nothing but respect. 070 was so sweet and willing. The big-headed bitch on the right had the craziest attitude, and she grasping onto shake like someone was trying to snatch her. Girl, relax. And bitch, you're not even fitted. Like, you know your new show just came out, you're trending, your dad was just in court. Don't walk around Soho looking this crazy, trench coat buttoned to the top, and these ballerina-ass slippers. What's going on? What am I doing with my life? Yeah. That's it.